Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Grant Fossey. I grew up in Hillsborough, so down about a half hour away from here, a little more on a day like today. And if you know Hillsborough at all, there was an old house out by the school on School Street. Old white house with green trim. And back in, I think it was 1921, John Sterling was actually born in that house. His parents were boarding there. He grew up in Hillsborough. He worked at the IGA. He was a janitor at the school next door. His wife Arlene babysat local kids before you needed a daycare license to do things like that. And he eventually bought that house and raised a family there. About the time I was going to high school, there were a string of suspicious fires around Hillsborough. We lost our historic covered bridge. A local restaurant down on Depot Street burned to the ground. And early in the morning of September 28, 1990, that White House with green trim caught on fire. Arlene and John made it to the porch. Arlene kept going, and for some reason, John Sterling turned around and went back into the house. Now, we don't know why he went back in, what he was going back in to get, and we'll never know because he never made it out again. John Sterling was my grandfather. It's been 20 years, and in the last 20 years, I and my family have not heard from the state police, from the Attorney General's office. I called them a year ago when this cold case unit was established, called them last week to find out if there had been any information on this open homicide, and hadn't heard back. John Sterling's murder has not been a priority for the state of New Hampshire for 20 years. Establishing a cold case unit did not make it a priority. By the Attorney General's own testimony, we know that these cases aren't a priority because they didn't bother looking into them. They didn't bother using resources until they got free money from the federal government. And I wrote a piece for the Monitor about a year ago called "It's Easy to Care with Somebody Else's Money." And that's what happened here. There was free money from the federal government that allowed politicians and our law enforcement community to tell us, the families of these victims, how compassionate they were and how much they wanted to solve these crimes. They hadn't for 19 years in my case, for 30, 40 years in other cases, because it simply wasn't that high on the list. There were limited resources, and there were cases with active leads that they were investigating, and rightly so. It seems to me that we're setting criminal justice policy based largely on CBS's primetime lineup and not on the possibility of actually getting convictions. Let's look at the record of this cold case unit over the last year. $400,000 in federal stimulus money to set up this unit. They've got a website. They've had one arrest. And if you read the report that they published in December, you can see they had one other lead. They dug a hole, didn't find anything in another case. This unit is a boondoggle. It is a waste of money. And if it were truly a priority for the Attorney General's office and our police, then they would have dedicated the resources over the past decades to look into these cases. But it's not a priority. They come to you looking for extra money at a time when nobody in state government has extra money, at a time when we're facing a $900 million budget deficit. They want extra money for cases that, by their own testimony, they admit aren't as high a priority. We can't afford it. As a family member of a victim of an unsolved homicide, yes, I'd like justice. I'd like closure. But this dedicated unit at $400,000 a year, I really have no confidence that I'm going to get justice, that I'm going to get closure. What we're going to do is spend a lot of money to try to convince us of the illusion of compassion on behalf of the state. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Fizz?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Bosky.
Representative?
Do you feel that if one or two cases were solved, that wouldn't help some families? I don't think we can. Please, I don't feel that we should go after every case immediately. But if they were to solve 2 or 3 or a couple, that helps.
Well, of course, every case that's solved helps. but how are we using those resources? And what could we do in the Attorney General's office and with the state police with that $400,000? How many cases in the last year have gone cold for lack of proper investigation because they didn't have the resources, because they were putting it into this dedicated unit? I certainly would hope our state police and our local police would solve every crime. I know that's never gonna happen. I don't expect miracles from them. And I know they're working very hard to bring justice to these victims and their families. But we have to look at how efficiently we can solve these crimes and the best use of our resources as taxpayers. And at $400,000 to set up a special unit, it just doesn't seem to me a very efficient way to get justice. If the Attorney General's office thinks they have promising leads in these cold cases, then he has every ability within his current budget to do that. The fact that they haven't done this within their current budget, that they'll only do it if they can get extra money from first the federal government, and now looking for state taxpayers to pick up this temporary program and make it permanent, tells me that it's not a very efficient use of their resources. That given the choice, the Attorney General and the state police would have more efficient uses for this money. But hey, if it's free money, if it's extra money, sure, we can find a way to spend it. I think there are more efficient ways to get justice for these victims and their families.
Would you believe that I don't believe this is free money? But I'd like to ask you, do you have a price that you would pay to find out who murdered your grandfather?
I'd pay anything. I would, but you as a legislature have to make very difficult choices about what you do with New Hampshire's limited resources. And the way this unit has been set up, the fact that these cases haven't been investigated for so long, tells me that it's not a priority for the people that write the budgets. It's not a priority for the prosecutors. It's a priority if and only if they can get the extra funding to do it. There's a lot of things we'd like to do if we had extra money. But the priorities, the things that we know are important, are the things we make room for, the things we move to the top of the list.
It's a would you believe. But we have 6 open cases in Portsmouth. Some of them date back to the 80s. And I know that our detectives down there work on them every chance they get. But they have to take care of the current crime before they can go back to the old crime. And I think this is why I was one of the sponsors of this bill, because I believe it needs to be done. That people like you need to be told what happened to your grandfather.
And Representative, I definitely believe that, and I want to know what happened. There are all sorts of rumors around town about what happened, and some people have some suspicions about what happened. There was obviously not enough to bring a case to trial. And if there were leads, absolutely they could be followed up on. My point is, we do not need this specialized unit in order to follow up on those cases. There is nothing preventing, other than other priorities, local law enforcement, state law enforcement, from prosecuting these cases, from investigating these cases. They can do it within the current budget. And when somebody comes looking for extra money, that tells me that it's not really a priority. It's a nice thing to do if they can get the extra funding. I would like them to be able to dedicate resources within their current budget to address these cases. If they're coming up, these stay open. There's no statute of limitations on murder. My grandfather's case will remain open until somebody is caught. I just don't see that happening, and I don't see a dedicated unit doing anything to improve those chances.
Representative Warden.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony. You talked about shifting priorities and working within a limited pie, a limited amount of funds. Could you suggest to the committee other parts of law enforcement, other crimes that are currently being prosecuted that maybe should have a lower priority to give more resources to homicide?
No, and I would ask the Attorney General in New Hampshire, we defer a lot to our department heads to set priorities, and again, it tells me that this isn't as high a priority as the regular operations of the Attorney General's Office of the State Police. If it was, they'd be doing it. If it was, they would have been doing it for the 20 and 30 years before the stimulus grant came along. So if the Attorney General really doesn't think that they can afford a cold case unit unless they get extra funding, well, you have to look at the department budget as a whole. Is any department going to be getting extra money this year? I don't think so. I don't think any department in state government is going to be getting a big raise. Every department's going to have to make do with less. And they're going to have to set priorities, real priorities, and this legislature is going to limit what departments can spend money on. And if you truly think that this is a higher priority than the regular operations of the Attorney General's office, then by all means, you can dedicate funding for that. That's your decision as our elected representatives. I wouldn't presume to write the Attorney General's budget for him. And if he would think that this is important enough to pay for without extra money coming from the legislature, I think the legislature would defer to his judgment. But he hasn't said that. He said, this is what we want to do, and we want to do this. Please give us more money for that.
You have to follow, no? Okay. I just wanted to ask Mr. Swanson something. Is this under the Department of Justice or is this under the Attorney General?
It's my understanding it's a function within the Department of Justice, but it's manned as Attorney Jalper's head by two troopers assigned to the unit. And correct me if I'm wrong.
So it's under the Department of Justice, not under the Attorney General?
Well, the Attorney General is
Oh,
it's the same organization.
We use both, now we use both titles.
Yes, Representative Sharon.
Mr. Bossy, one of the things, would you believe, I have to make sure I say that I picked up on when we first listened to this whole process of application for a cold case unit a couple of years ago, was the issue of detectives not having the ability to be specifically assigned, would you believe, to cases. And what would happen, I know before, would you believe, that as having some experience in investigation, you need consistency of that investigation as opposed to helter-skelter. Two guys who work the case and then they're gone, another two come on, but they get called out for traffic stop or something. And to me, that was the important thing, would you believe, of this whole process, so that we would have a dedicated unit to put their time and effort in something that means so much for those hundred some odd families.
I would believe that that is important to the investigative technique. What I do not believe is that there is anything preventing those techniques from being used outside of a dedicated unit and a dedicated funding stream. If it is that important, if it is as important as the Attorney General's office and the local police officers and the other people advocating for this extra money say it is, then we should make it a priority. And we should put it within the regular operations of the Department of Justice and the Attorney General and the state police, and we make that part of their job, and we tell them that's a priority. And you will use resources within your departments to address these cold cases. We haven't done that. We have told them to work on active cases with more promising leads. And I think as a committee, this is a good object lesson for you when you see a bill come forward with an FN after it. You're going to get a lot of people who want you to spend that money coming and tell you that they need that money and how important it is. You are not going to get as many people coming in and telling you to use restraint in your spending. And that is just a function of the way our democracy works, the way rent-seeking behavior works. And so I wanted to come here today as a relative of one of these victims to say, you need to set priorities. And I do not take your use of money as a substitute for compassion. I know that we care. I know that our law enforcement officials work hard and they care. You do not need to spend extra money to tell me how much you care. That is the illusion of compassion, not the reality. If we want to make this a priority, there's nothing preventing us from making this a priority. We do not need extra state money to do it.